Welcome to Friday night's video and our second master series. I do believe this is the 80th video in our second master series, the 29th video in our basic processors, and the 16th video on reverb and convolution. So basically, I hope you really understood that last video. I was talking about deverb, taking your environment into consideration, and how those two things between the environment and whatever reverberation you're using with your convolution, that it's going to convolve and can cause problems, and to really start taking it into consideration, and that tool can be immensely helpful in helping you take care of things that you didn't isolate well enough. So basically, we are getting into parameters now, and the first thing we wanted to talk about is with our convolution reverb, we're going to get into all the parameters, but I want to make something really clear when we're talking about our convolution reverb. So we talked about a whole lot of things with our convolution reverb, of being able to manipulate our impulse responses, to sculpt them and equalize them to make them sound like they're really good rooms, that we're trying to imprint that atmosphere and environment onto our tracks. So once we've gotten to the point that we really are taking this consideration of manipulating our environment to this level, that why I say the convolution reverb is your next biggest gun, and most of the time it's one of the simplest applications you have. It may seem really complicated, and there's a lot of parameters and there's a lot of things going on, but it really isn't once you really think about it. Because once you understand all the work that you may do preparing your impulse responses and preparing before your captures and cleaning them up and things like that, that the application of convolution reverb a lot of times is your most basic parameters. You have a couple different things that you really want to get in your head are the most fundamental and basic usage of it, that are going to be the most powerful in your production to accomplish that richness, thickness, lushness, presence, atmosphere, ambience, and things like that. Those things are going to be your automation. So we'll get into automation when we get into the DAW and the tools in the DAW that we've talked about a little bit. If you look at the automation video when we're talking about the convolution reverb here, and your simple wet and dry, trying to understand that there's a couple concepts here. Your simple wet and dry, that we talked about, if you have bad impulse responses or ones you haven't sculpted well and you haven't EQ'd well, you haven't cleaned them up and done all the work we talked about, that you add a lot sometimes to get some kind of effect, but it's actually detrimental across a production. Whereas the sound sculpted ones you have, sometimes you got to add very little of it. I see sometimes you'd be surprised how many times I add 0.5% or 0.25% or 0.2% on a track that just adds this to it, which seems ridiculous, but in the end, the track comes out sounding awesome. So it really comes down to you really mastering the convolution reverb. And when we start talking about parameters, is you will find mastering the things we've talked about so far, and mastering your automation use of it, the considerations that we talked about, and you really thinking about where that's going to be applicable and what convolution reverb is actually doing at every moment in time, to be able to automate how much of it you're putting in there from your wet and dry, and mastering your wet and dry. Well, when you got an out front track, you might be able to add 10%. That's a lot, really a lot of times. But you might really be able to add it pretty heavy in some spots on out front tracks. Whereas things farther back in the mix, you really want to back way off on, because you're going to start polluting the mix, causing mud and messiness and things like that, which most of the time comes down to your spatialization reverb. Your bodybuilding reverb is usually, it doesn't get too conflicting there, because most of the time you're not using it really heavy. And that takes time mastering, but it's something for you to become that next master audio engineer. You need to really work on your acute listening and your critical listening. And the same thing with your spatialization reverb, but a little bit differently. So, when we start talking about parameters on the convolution reverb, there's lots of parameters here that we're going to talk about in the coming videos, but you will find the manipulation and prep work that you do, and then the work that you've done on the impulse responses themselves will take care of most of that work, to where a lot of these other parameters won't be coming into play, and probably shouldn't, because the power of your convolution reverb is really going to boil down to you mastering the automation, things like we talked about, thinking about that, where that's applicable, and automating your wet and dry, and just plain old mastering how much of wet and dry you can add, so that you achieve a not polluted mix by it sounding like a lot of reverb, but sounding like you've really added lushness, fullness, thickness, presence, ambience and atmosphere to a track, and to the subgroups, and to the mix itself, and how much you can apply there, and going back in stages and looking at rework and things like we talked about, going one step forward, one step back, or two steps back, to see if you have to redo things in the workflow of the three areas that you'll probably be using it: individual tracks, subgroups, and the mix as a whole, to help blend things and to make them sound like they're in their space together, sometimes using bodybuilding to try to blend them a little bit together with your spatialization reverbs. This is a process that the more you think about it and the more you practice it, the better you'll get at it. But the power in your convolution reverb is really going to boil down to, most of the time, mastering the things we've talked about, mastering the automation of your wet and dry, mastering, your wet and dry itself. So this is a huge concept to really get in your head, so that you don't get lost in all these other parameters. You really have to understand that, like, let's say, let me give you an example. An example is like, let's say I've got this is Voxengo old school reverb. Now this old school reverb has a bunch of parameters on it, right? And a bunch of other, parameters on there. And what are these doing? These are basically trying to manipulate the reverberation effect, which basically means you're trying to sculpt the room per se with some type of reverb. Or if I go to another reverb like I have in my DAW, that's a stock reverb, that I have like a room reverb. Let me see if I can find my room reverb. My room reverb. If I go to like my room reverb, it's basically, most of the parameters set up trying to sculpt the room as best as possible with a coded algorithm, formulas, and things like that are going to try to emulate a well done impulse response or a boutique response that has been captured from a really nice room. And it's really that simple. And any of the other things that you do with the other parameters, that it's really, you have to really be careful that, on out front tracks, some things your convolution reverb may be able to do will be audible, and the listener will be able to tell those things are happening. Whereas things go back farther in the mix, you want to keep things much simpler, because they're not going to hear some little things you did. Does that make sense? And we had talked about that in our first master series, that over processing and spending too much time fussing with stuff that ain't going to get heard is a waste of time. If it's not going to get heard, why are you doing it? So this is a huge concept. So sometimes on out front tracks or supportive tracks, like you're talking about, harmonies to supporting or to out front vocals, that sometimes you've got some play. They're going to be very audible what you do to them. And so you start fussing around some of these other parameters on your convolution reverb are going to have an audible effect, and can have not just basic effects of the spatialization and bodybuilding, but can end up having different effects. But also keep in mind that if you remember my first master series, the spatialization techniques we were putting in, doubling tracks, putting delay on them, detuning them, doing all kinds of things, that a lot of that, putting echo effect on there, echo effect mixed with your convolution reverb work that you've done adds another element of spatialization that helps build this ambience, atmosphere, and spatialization effect. So it's going to be done in those areas a lot more than probably with other parameters you're looking at on your convolution reverb. And you're really going to want to focus on mastering your automation of your wet and dry, and just mastering the wet and dry effect. How much you can put on there, master the amount you can, master the things we've talked about sculpting your frequency or your impulse responses and shaping them, and how you apply them, usage of them, and where you can use the things out front in the mix. You can add more than you can stuff in the back, that you can add more to things on top of a mix, like an out front vocal, and have a lot less on things behind it, because it'll make the whole production sound like it has more reverb, just because of that out front vocal having more on it, if you're trying to get it sound like it's a lot of reverb going on. And that's debatable, and you have to be real careful about how much you can add. The more instruments you have, you'll find the less you can add, because it multiplies. And all these things take into consideration that the first concept when we talk about parameters on our convolution reverb is our most basic parameter, our wet and dry, because we've already done all our work to our impulse responses. It's just how much we can add on, which impulse response is going to work best, and how much of it can we use, how much can we add in, rather than have to worry about all these other things going on that really are going to deter and from the basic principle and the power of the convolution reverb, putting things in their space and bodybuilding, and also can contribute to convoluting your tracks and your mix to making a muddy mess by you over processing, doing a bunch of crap that really isn't adding to the effect. Whereas sometimes if all you have is like a room reverb here, that you spend a lot of time learning how to use this to emulate different rooms, if it's a good one and you really understand what you're doing and what the effect is and what it's trying to do, and analyzing it, is a different situation, because all the work's already been done, and you just want to know which one you can use and how much you can use to have the effect of what you want. You've got a hyper clean production, you've got one that's not quite so hyper clean, one that's a little bit messier, but those ones aren't normally too far away from each other, unless you get stuff that's like you're wanting to sound like it's reverby and there's a lot of reverb, or the production was recorded in a bad room and it's got this old retro sound because there wasn't a lot of control of environment, and things like that have to be taken into consideration to get the effect you want. But when we start talking about parameters, this is going to be the most basic parameter that you really need to master, along with the other things we've talked about. And you're using your impulse responses, crafting them, sculpting them, choosing them, and things like that. And other than that, when you start to understand it, as you master this one parameter, and using it is presets. Go on main vocals, certain times main vocals and certain applications and things like that. I'm going to store this preset as rockabilly, in this environment, and and as a starting point to work from, so that no matter how good you are, that having a reference, you already have these impulse responses, but presets of how you had it set up, how much you used of it, that are starting points for certain type of productions, whether they're hyper clean, not quite as hyper clean, or a lot less hyper clean, or really reverby. How much of it you are adding on there in certain situations, in chorus areas, or in bridge areas, or in the verse area, what kind of automation work you do, and taking pictures of the automation work you did, and studying it and analyzing it until once you got it down to where it sounds, we talked about the automation, and want to get you thinking about it, because automating it is very applicable and can have a huge impact on your production, to where it's every moment in time, and how much you're using of it is taken into consideration to make every moment in time as important as possible, just from this one parameter. So that's our first video on parameters, and that's probably the biggest thing you really need to get into your head. And I will see you in the next video when we start looking at some of the other parameters. Peace, hope, love. See you in the next vid.